Good afternoon and welcome to the College of Continuing and Professional Studies webinar, Dynamics of Power in the Workplace. Thank you so much for joining us. Next slide, please. It's a pleasure to have you all here this afternoon. My name is Shanta Bulai, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. If you have future questions about this webinar or other programs we offer, the college's contact information will be on the last slide of this presentation. I'm delighted to introduce the topic for today's webinar, Dynamics of Power in the Workplace. There are 5 types of power in the workplace: legitimate, authority given by an organization, a formal right to command others; reward, the ability for someone to reward compliance; expert, possessing skills and knowledge; referent, having gained a reputation, respect, or trustworthiness by others; coercive, possessing the ability to punish. When any of these types of powers veer off into their negative aspects, the workplace can get quite uncomfortable, whether it's favoritism, lack of communication, inequitable workloads, or micromanaging. Dealing with toxic power differentials can detrimental not only to individual well-being and productivity, but also the organization. Join us as we explore challenges faced with those in positions of authority at work, examine the different types of power in the workplace, get tactics to neutralize power in the workplace, and lastly, learn to express constructive disagreement with those in leadership positions. It's a pleasure to have you and introduce the presenter for today's webinar, Jim Moore. I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Shanta. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to spend some time with us with this topic and this notion of power. And it might be maybe have some negative connotations or a sensitive topic at best. But one of the things that I want us to think about is that power is going to happen no matter where we are. Whenever we get a group of human beings together, there is going to be usually some element of power. Here's the thing. It doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. What we need to do is recognize it, recognize and understand what power is and the different types of power, but then there are very specific things that we can do. Some of them will seem very commonsensical, but yet they can be powerful to help us have more productive meetings, more productive interactions with people. And one of the things that I have a huge heart for is helping us to disagree with each other in ways that preserve relationships. That's so important. And I know it's important to all of you as well. So we're going to go through some different things. And here are the agenda and outcomes that we're going to be trying to achieve. I want to let you know that there'll be plenty of time for Q&A that Shanta and I will be doing. We'll probably have the last 15 minutes of our time together for Q&A. And we'll make sure that you're done at least, on the hour or 5 minutes before, so you can get on with your busy day. Again, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. So we can get out of whatever you might be thinking about today and whatever, trying to get us introduced a little bit to this topic. I would love for you to use the chat feature in this Zoom meeting to answer the following question. And by the way, I'm going to actually give you 2 questions, and you can take this anywhere you want to. How might you define power in your workplace right now? And what challenges, if any, are you facing? You may not be facing any challenges, but maybe a better way to ask this question is, what are you noticing? What do you notice, and how does power in the workplace show up? So participation in this is not mandatory. If you don't feel comfortable sharing anything, that's totally fine. But I would love to see where you're at right now from a power standpoint. And again, leverage the chat feature that is in the Zoom meeting. All right, I'm seeing a whole bunch here. Thank you for sharing. Decision-making, who's consulted? Hierarchical, okay, by title, tenure. Making decisions, who has direct power, who gets the final word. I love that. Okay, lack of respect, that can definitely happen. Yeah, ultimate saying decisions. Changing, hierarchy. I'm just scrolling through some of these. These are great. Thank you, by the way, for sharing with me. It's not always transparent who has the power. Well, that does happen. Unable to say no. I felt that way in my job too. Okay. Oh, equitable. That's good. If you're scrolling with this through me, I'm seeing some definitely some themes. And it's interesting too, some of you are mentioning that there's a dynamic going on when it comes to how different interactions are now that many of us work remote. We're having this session right now remotely. Sometimes it can be toxic. Yeah. I see a lot of themes on influencing decisions. And I'm also glad that you're mentioning influence, because that definitely has something to do with it as well. Still scrolling a little bit more. Wow, you guys are really come to play. Thank you. 91 responses. Huh. I love to see that there is some where power seems to be fairly distributed. And here's another aspect that someone's bringing up, which I appreciate. Sometimes certain departments on certain topics have power over other things. And yeah, it's just it's a really interesting thing. The way I could define this, by the way, in my own work life, Shanta asked me to introduce myself, and I forgot to do that. My name is Jim Hoare, and I am an instructor right now in the College of Continuing and Professional Studies. I have my own leadership consultancy. I'm in private practice right now. But before that, I spent 32 years in a Fortune 30 company, and I had various functions in the buying office, in IT, did a little work in HR, and did a whole lot of work in training and development and leadership development. So sorry I didn't give you that background before. How I would define workplace power in the workplace, a lot of times it manifested itself in what I call wordsmithing. I'm sure that's never happened to you, that when you had a PowerPoint deck, you had to get buy-in and sign off from people, usually people in positions of authority above you. And you had to, I can tell you that after about the 9th iteration of having my PowerPoint manipulated, like people hanging on different words, that can sometimes be a little bit frustrating. And again, that's just a challenge. Sometimes you feel workplace power a little bit more, and clearly some of you are not thinking that it's actually a good thing. But again, we have to recognize it, because it does happen whenever we get a group of human beings together. And when we think about challenges when we're dealing with power, most people think about with their immediate supervisor. And this is research from the National Business Research Institute. I can tell you that this research was not necessarily from 2022, but the literature hasn't changed a ton on this as of late. But in terms of challenges that we sometimes have with people in power, lack of communication on what's happening and why, feeling unappreciative or unappreciated. I don't know if any of you have heard of Carol Dweck and her book called Mindset. Carol is a researcher in the field of positive psychology, and her book Mindset was very, very popular a few years ago. And some of her research would say, at a minimum, just to keep people on track, you needed 4 pieces of positive feedback for every 1 piece of constructive feedback. And I'm sad to report, when we talk about feeling unappreciated, is that it's actually the opposite in terms of what actually happens in the workplace. We get 4 pieces of constructive feedback for every 1 piece of positive feedback. So a lot of times it's not necessarily affirming or feeling appreciated. Sometimes there's favoritism in the workplace, issues with workload and even distribution of work. And one of the most common challenges, which we'll try to talk about a little in terms of productive candor with those who are our leaders, is the concept of micromanaging. And this can happen with the person who's the level above you, or even several levels above you, where they're getting into an inappropriate level of detail in their role versus your role. It happens all the time, and these are different aspects of power. Again, our theme here is to recognize that power exists, to understand it, and then think about productive ways that we can be thoughtful in our interactions with others to make it a more productive environment, understanding that there is a power dynamic there. So, how do we do that? Well, first off, we got to know what power actually looks like. And again, you could probably Google different types of power, and you're going to get generally the same list. I have not found that the research on this has changed significantly over time, but this is these are the main types of power. Now, Shanta mentioned this at a very high level. The first one is legitimate power. And legitimate means that it was bestowed onto the person from the organization. And that's usually a person in a position of leadership, or what I call formal authority. So a boss, a director, a senior director, a vice president. And so the person's power is directly tied to the organization granting it to them. If they get a position and they become a manager, they get a certain form of legitimate power. And these are not bad things. Again, we just want to recognize what kind of power do people have and what do we do with it. The second one is reward power. And this is the ability for people to reward employees with good behavior, so on. I mean, the things that people think about with reward power tend to be promotions, raises, things like that. And so a lot of people will ask me, Jim, how is legitimate different than reward? Aren't those two the same? Isn't that usually the same person? Well, sometimes yes, and sometimes no. I'll give you an example. There have been plenty of senior leader assistants that I've worked with who actually have reward power. And their reward power was the ability for you to get an appointment to see a senior vice president, to see the CEO, because their time is precious and many people want to talk to them. So a reward power isn't always the typical things that we think of as position or money. Sometimes people are gatekeepers of other people's time, and they have reward power as well. Again, not good or bad. It's just something we want to recognize and acknowledge that's there. So reward power is interesting. Expert power. If you have a particular knowledge or expertise that's deep in a particular topic, many of you who have joined this webinar probably have that. If you are a software engineer and you know a certain language and you are considered, you have achieved mastery at that, that can be a form of expert power. People who are lawyers, people who are doctors, people who are accountants. Expert power rises when the expertise is not distributed over a wide variety of people. So again, specialty occupations sometimes reward that. And so if you think about expert power, if a person in a meeting situation, for instance, says something that is within the realm of where they're considered an expert, they have power, because people go, oh, well, that's an expert. They know software engineering. Therefore, they have more power in that meeting maybe than in other scenarios. But it's not given to them by the organization. It is a consequence of the skills, the training, the expertise that they have had to achieve expert power. And I would venture to guess some of you have expert power and you probably don't even think about it. The next one is related but different. Referent power means what kind of reputation does this person have in the organization? Are they highly respected? Are they highly admired? When they open their mouth in a meeting, does everyone stop talking and listen? Often, this is people who have long tenure in the organization. And sometimes they have expert power as well. But we need to separate the two, because there are plenty of people I've met in my working life that have had referent power, meaning they were beloved, they were respected, their opinion when they weighed in on something really counted, but they may or may not have been an expert in any one particular field. So we've got legitimate, we've got reward, we've got expert and referent. The last one is probably one that we don't want to think or talk about too much, and that's coercive power. And that's the ability to basically hand out punishments, for lack of a better term. The ability to punish. And I suppose in a way, legitimate and coercive power can be linked together, but it can be linked together in different ways. So coercive power, we tend to think about, does the person have the ability to fire someone or remove them from the organization? Very rarely, by the way, do people leverage coercive power. They only leverage coercive power usually in two instances. There's a crisis or there's a lack of time, because coercive power obviously can be very destructive to relationships and to organizations. People, it's sometimes referred to as making the hard decision, but that one is fairly kind of, I don't know, not used very often. So these are the top 5 that the literature would suggest are different types of power. Again, you could go out and Google and probably get academic research that maybe shows different wording, but these, in my experience, these have been the top 5. So now that we know what they are, that's great, Jim, but what do we do with it? Okay. So I want to talk about some tactics to neutralize power in various work settings that might be helpful to you. Now, the first one is one that I first observed and then someone taught me to do. And I want you to think about when you have a meeting that requires solution generation, including brainstorming. There's a problem that we all have sometimes when a person who has positional power is in the room or on the Zoom call. And the problem is as soon as that person opens their mouth, everyone defers to that opinion. And that may or may not be the best idea that's in the room. A lot of times, even that leader would say, I'm not the smartest person in the room. But yet, we all go along with the person who is of rank, so to speak. And that flavor, or that, how do I say, that phenomena happens and is accelerated even more when it's someone several levels above everyone else. So what do we do? Well, one of the things that we do is we bring Post-it notes. And if any of you are in the professional consulting world, this is not new to you at all. I've learned it from people that work at McKinsey, Accenture, Booz Allen Hamilton. You'll often see these people facilitating meetings, brainstorming sessions with senior leaders, and they come in with a tote box of Post-it notes. Now, the question is, why would we do that? Well, unless we know each individual person's in the room, their handwriting, we're not going to know. Every idea has a quality when we don't know where it came from. So if we are together in a room, what we would do is have Post-it notes, one idea per Post-it, and have people just randomly put them either up on a board or a flip chart. And there are now Post-it note types of tools that also can be used in Zoom meetings. Now, I haven't personally used them, but I've had colleagues that do. And you usually can find a tool where the Post-it note does not tie the idea to a person's individual name, and that's key. So there are ways that we can do this. And what we want to do is have each idea just stand on its own merit. It's a little thing. It sounds very commonsensical. But if you try it sometime, particularly in a live meeting, you'll find that you get more ideas and more robust debate between ideas when we don't know where they came from. So it's a little thing, but I have found it personally to be very, very effective. The second tactic we can use, and maybe it isn't to neutralize power, but it's to harness it in productive ways, is talking about a pre-meeting conversation with your boss or their boss, whoever's going to be maybe the highest ranking person in the meeting, and talk about the impact on having them show up, on attendance. Now, this is a tricky meeting. You may or may not want someone, this is a hard question to ask. Like, should you show up at the meeting? And then someone might get defensive and say, well, what do you mean? Of course I'm going to show up at the meeting. The better question to ask is, I want to think through with you, what is the impact of you being there or not being there? And literally have that dialogue. This is not something, by the way, that you want to do right before you walk into the meeting. This has to be thoughtful. And that's a theme you're going to find throughout our conversation with tactics to neutralize power and to be more candid with people in power. We have to be thoughtful before we actually enter the arena or enter the room where other people are going to be. So this is, again, reaching out, phone call, Zoom call, face-to-face, whatever you want, and just say, hey, I want to think about this meeting. Now, here's the other thing I want to call to your attention in a pre-meeting conversation. We are not going to do this for your weekly team meeting. We're doing this for meetings where there is a very big impact that's going to happen. We're going to make a key decision. We're going to decide on allocation of resources. We're going to make some big decisions here. Or we're going to come up with some big ideas that are going to, decide the future of this organization or projects. They got to be a big meeting. And to have a conversation with your boss, it would look like a little text message or an email saying, hi, I'm doing meeting prep for our upcoming meeting on X. Can I have a quick conversation with you to prep for that? No one's going to say no. And when you get to that arena and start talking to the person, just say, I'm thinking through the impact of you being there versus not, and when you might want to enter the meeting. Here's the thing. We probably need them there or want them there, or maybe they want to be there, but maybe they don't come at the beginning. Or if they are going to be there for the entire meeting, maybe they don't weigh in on a particular decision or idea or topic until everyone else is weighed in. There are little things we can do. And here's the thing. No one's that thoughtful usually when we just go to a meeting. The topic's there, we talk about it, make a decision, we're done. The more thoughtful we can be, the more we can channel power in a positive way. Most leaders I've worked with have been very receptive to this conversation. You just have to frame it up the right way. And you might even want to have a list of positive and negative impacts for that person being there. Because one of the things that one of my bosses would probably ask me is, why, don't you think I should be there? And just say, I'm trying to assess the impacts. I want to make sure that no one feels like they can't respond or contribute to the conversation. So it's a little thing, but again, it can have big impact. As I'm fond of saying in my own private practice, common sense is not always common practice when we're doing this type of work. Another form of meeting prep that you can do, and again, this has to happen well before the meeting actually happens, is to map out who's going to be in the room. Now, when I say the room, it can be virtual as well. Who's showing up at the Zoom call or who's physically going to be around the table. And I want to show you an example of mapping and assessing power. So let's say that we're going to have a meeting, and it's an important meeting, and we brought in people from different functional areas because we're going to need their help. We're going to need collaboration. We might want to just take a look at the room. And again, it's almost like I'm hovering above the situation, and I'm looking down to see who is there and what might their interest be in this topic. What concerns might they have? What's going to be their position? And you can see by my map here, I have people from marketing, people from technology, people from finance, but not only do I have my boss there, but I have a couple of his peers. How is that going to change the dynamic in the room? What is the level of, and remember, let's go back to our power list. How many of these people have legitimate power, referent power, expert power? In a situation like this, we're probably not going to talk about reward power. Maybe we would, but really legitimate, referent, and expert are going to come to play in a meeting like this. What does this do for you? By mapping it out, you may need to talk to some of these people either ahead of time, shape the agenda with potential outcomes, but even in your own mind, come up with lists of what might their concerns be, what might they advocate for, and what outcome ultimately do we need to drive. Again, it's a little thing. It's a little thing to actually map this out. But if you want to be influential in having a productive meeting, it can be, again, very, very powerful. So again, pre-meeting with the boss, use Post-it notes either virtually or in person when you can, and sometimes create a power map. That can be helpful. The other aspect to this notion of power is we have trouble disagreeing with each other. We have trouble disagreeing with each other. And in particular, we have trouble disagreeing with people that we consider above us. Now, by the way, it's not always my boss or my boss's boss. It can be somebody in my department who has more tenure than I do. I may be the new person on the block, and the person that has maybe more referent power or expert power has been there 10, 15, 20 years. How do we disagree with people and still maintain relationships? I don't know about you, but I definitely want to maintain relationships, and I think all of you do too as well. So I want to give you a couple of phrases, words, things that might be helpful to you in service of fostering candor. This is so important, by the way, because if we don't, good candor, productive candor, takes an idea from an 8 to a 10. That's the goal. It's to help wrestle with an idea and make it even better. So here's one way to express a concern with something that somebody has said, particularly if they want to do an initiative, initiate a project, something like that. And I'd love to tell you that I thought of this one on my own, but I actually stole this one from my wife, who also worked with me in the same company. This is a key term. I invite you to use this. You might want to use this afternoon in your next meeting. Here's what I'm struggling with. The power in expressing your concern in this way is it puts the onus on you. You will not get usually a defensive response. This looks like a really good idea, but here's what I'm struggling with. And then just list your concerns. List your concerns in as an objective, unemotional way as you can. Hopefully you know what your concerns are prior to walking into the meeting, but maybe on the fly, you're just like, wow, that sounds like a great idea, but here's what I'm struggling with. A second one is, and this is, and here's an interesting thing. Most projects that we deal with have merit. What we struggle with is priority. Not why should we do this? Why should we do it now? And this is the money question for that. What do you see as the cost if we do nothing? And again, you don't use these all the time, but you use them when someone says, no, we have to do this now. This is priority one. And I want to know what they perceive as the cost if we do nothing. Maybe it involves a big change. Maybe it's going to involve lots of training, lots of money, lots of time. Not why, but why now? A lot of people can defend why their idea is good. But what I want to know is, why should it be done now versus many other things that could take priority? These are 3 words that I use a lot when I work with people. And again, you may look at this and say, well, Jim, thank you. This is like the Captain Obvious Award. If you use these three words as the start of your sentence, I think you'll be surprised at the impact you have on others. How might we? If you say how, you're sending a signal to the people in the group that you're wondering with them what the best solution is. Might means that you're open to many possibilities. You're not locked in and married to one idea. And can we do this together? It's not about me. It's about us as a group coming to the right conclusion. How might we solve for this budget problem? How might we take time out of the supply chain? How might we get our customer service scores even higher? When you do how might we, it's a term that I've learned from people who have a strength in innovation, group problem solving, and just being open to the possibilities. I've encouraged and coached many people to use these three words, and they can be powerful. So I invite you. These are three ways where you can express a concern, inquire about something, and still preserve relationships pretty well. There's another question that we can ask when people are entrenched in their opinion. Let's say that we're in a meeting. It might be your boss, it might be a colleague, it might be someone from another area, but they're adamant that this is the way we need to move forward, and they are so passionate about it. But let's say that there's not agreement in the room. We can't get consensus, we're not even close. If you're facilitating this meeting or want to get people unstuck, ask this question. This question comes from Roger Martin, the former dean of the business school at the University of Toronto. He says that if he had this question earlier in his career, he would probably be the CEO of some company. He says that in jest. But here's the power with this question. So literally in the meeting, you might ask this and say, what would need to be true in order for the idea that's on the table to be the best solution? And actually have people write out what would need to be true. It teases out the assumptions that the person has about the environment, the problem, and the solution. Again, this is not going to seem like rocket science. It's not. When you get people to write down what would need to be true in order for a particular idea to be the best, all the hidden assumptions that we have get unearthed, but then they get on the table so we can talk about them. What I get sometimes is people get really entrenched in their opinions and they can't let them go. And if we disagree with them, they feel like they're being personally attacked. So this is a way to increase productive candor, a little bit of debate and discussion by uncovering hidden assumptions. I had this one time with a person that I worked with, and the CEO of their organization wanted them to spend millions of dollars on something that they thought was not going to be a good spend of the money. And so I said, well, ask them this question. And the person came back to me and said, I can't ask the CEO this question, nor can my boss, or even my boss's boss. If you're in a situation like that, if the power dynamic is too hard to ask this question, answer it for them. And so here's how that would work. If I'm concerned about someone going a particular direction or spending a lot of money or time or creating this as a priority, you can say, well, these are the things that would need to be true in order for that to be a good spend of money. And just list out what you perceive to be what would need to be true. This question is so powerful that my friend Roger Martin has actually written a book on it. It's his latest book. And I think he would call it kind of the money question. I don't want to give money a bad connotation, but this will be one of those ways to break a tiebreaker When you've got a room, they don't disagree, or they don't agree, I'm sorry. There's lots of disagreement and people are entrenched in their opinions. Again, it has to be done in a very open way that I'm just trying to seek to get us unstuck. And you can either have people answer the question, or you can try to answer the question for them and see whether they agree with your assumptions. It's very powerful. The other thing that we have sometimes is, how do we give feedback to people, particularly in positions of power? Sometimes a good leader, like your boss, will ask you for feedback, and no one wants to tell the boss what they're not good at or what annoys them. How do we do this? How can we tell people that they did something in a meeting that affected us, not in a good way? I want to give you 3 more words. So I had 3 words that were how might we. This is another one. It would be even better if. It's a little bit of a softening agent, excuse me, when you give someone feedback. By the way, you can use this in asking for feedback as well. What could I do even better? But let's say that your boss did something in a meeting and you want to talk to them about it. And you can say, can I talk to you about the meeting that we just went through? And they'll be like, yeah, sure. It would be even better if, and then suggest new behavior. Now, you must make sure that you tie it back to a very specific place and time. This is not a time to give a generalization. Like, it would be even better if you would stop disagreeing with me all the time. Whenever you hear all, always, or never, all the time, people are just going to turn you off and not necessarily pay attention. So we tie the feedback to a specific place and time. We also don't judge motive. So often what you need to do is share the behavior first and say, in the meeting that we just went through, I noticed that you said X. And the impact on me was Y. So in the future, it would be even better if you did X. Or sometimes you don't even need to say even better if. If you just share the behavior and the impact it had on you, see what they say. A lot of times we're raising the awareness of someone, but again, we want to do it in a way that doesn't make them feel defensive or attacked, or that they're a bad person or anything like that. So again, even better if, it's a great way to give feedback. It's also a great way to ask for feedback. And I hope, by the way, that you ask as much as you give. And by the way, don't ever ask, how am I doing? Everyone's going to say, fine. Say, what could I have done even better on this project? And then people will give you the real deal. So those are some things we can do to foster productive candor, okay? I'm going to give you a scenario right now, and I invite you to say, what would you say to your boss in this particular scenario? And you can use the chat room, okay? So this actually happened to me early on in my career. There was a huge push to reduce expenses. And either my boss or my boss's boss, I can't remember, wanted to track productivity on the team. And they literally by hour wanted to track the time that you spend on each activity you do, and they wanted to do this for a month. Your concern is that this will generate a ton of workload, and you're barely keeping your head above water right now. You barely have enough time to answer emails, Slack chats, inquiries, and get your work done. So I'm going to pause for a minute. I'm sorry I've been talking a lot, but I'm going to look at the chat view, and I would love to see, what would you say? How would you respond if your boss asked to do this and you had concerns? Can we meet to discuss the key tracking? Oh, why now? Yeah. Yeah, I see from Samantha, talking about it, I feel if my productivity and efficiency are in question, you could ask and say, is there a concern about productivity within the group? Tell me more. How can we streamline this? Robin is using, here's what I'm struggling with. Is there another way? I'm struggling with how we can implement this. These are all good. You guys are catching on. You're all thriving in this, and this did happen to me, but it's not just a month, it was forever. Wow. What do you expect to see and learn? That's a great question. What little level of detail? These are all really good suggestions. What is the goal? How do you feel this will lead to the outcome you desire? Yes. I have smart people on this webinar. This is outstanding. I'm going to scroll down and get a few more before we move on. So Laura says, I'd like to prioritize this project. Which of my other projects can take a back burner right now? That is actually a really strong influence technique because it allows the boss to choose from the priorities that are already on the table. I've actually used that one. That's a good one. These are all good, actually. I don't want to help me to understand. Hello, Burkhard. Good to hear from you. Burkhard is a fellow colleague of mine back in the day. Wow, you guys are just rocking it. This is good. So you're getting a feel for it. This is something that could come up pretty often at the workplace. Here's what I'm struggling with. How will this help us achieve how will this help us achieve the outcome that you're seeking? Are there concerns about our productivity right now? There's a lot of different ways we could take this conversation, but again, we're just going to have dialogue, and we can do it in a way that does not damage the relationship we have with the other person. We're just seeking to understand, and we can also express concern. So I think you're getting it. That's good, and I'm excited by this. This is good. Now, if you're wondering why we were talking about power in the workplace, it's an element of influence. And I'm going to make a shameless plug because that's what I do. I'm an instructor for CCAPs, and we do a workshop, a class on how can you be more intentional in your influence, of which power is a big dynamic. So if you join me on the influence journey at some point in your career, and I invite you to do so, we're going to talk a lot about who you should be influencing to achieve the outcomes, how you should influence others. What does the research say about influence tactics? And by the way, we do acknowledge in the who and the how that there is a power dynamic, and how do we deal with that? What kinds of messaging? When we say the who in the influence scenario and influence tactics, how do we even start that conversation? What are some things that we want to say to create a receptive environment for dialogue? Oh, and then finally, the other thing too, we're going to also talk about something that I call the irony of influence, which means that I'll just give you a taste of what that would look like in intentional influence. The irony of influence is you are an effective influencer to the extent that you allow others to influence you. That's an ironic statement. I'll say it again because it's important. Effective influencers allow others to influence them. And that's actually part of the influence journey. So if you are interested in this at all, I'm going to turn this back over to Shanta, who's going to talk a little bit about how you can register and how you can find out more, not just about intentional influence, but all the great offerings that the College of Continuing and Professional Studies offer. Shanta, I will move on to the next slide.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jim. And we're just going to do a couple of questions here. So if folks have any questions they want to submit in the Q&A, I did capture a few. I do want to apologize in advance. We do have quite a lot of questions here. So if I don't get through all of them, I apologize. So our first question is, where does identity power fall in this list? I am in the DEI space, and folks who are part of the white dominant culture, specifically white cisgender, have inherent systematic power over those who are not.
It's a really good question. And in terms of the literature, it is there. It's its own field in terms of identity power. One of the things I will say, though, is, and again, this is just me not having a ton of experience with that literature, identity power, and it does show up. It is a challenge that we're dealing with. I'm wondering with you as the question asker, can we use the tactics that we would use for legitimate power in a similar way for identity power? Again, it's its own kind of conversation in and of itself. Part of the challenge, I think, is people are unaware that identity power even exists. And obviously it's within the majority, the people that have that power. And so part of this is informal conversations, talking about how it shows up and just increasing awareness. But the other thing I go back to is, can we leverage some of those legitimate power things that we've already discussed and think about those, like pre-meeting conversations, mapping identity power in a meeting before we even get started, particularly on sensitive topics. That's what my initial thinking is. I'm not an expert, but that's kind of my initial thinking right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next one, how would you work around the post-it note suggestion when a boss is particular about how a meeting is run? For example, micromanaging, coercive, or other.
Could you repeat that, Shanta? I want to make sure I understand it.
How would you work around the post-it note suggestion when a boss is particular about how a meeting is run? For example, micromanaging or coercive.
Okay. One of the things I would say is, so let's say that I advocate for the post-it note idea and the boss is like, we don't need that, or we're not going to do that. What I would come back to them and say is, well, whoever is the highest ranking person in the room, everyone's going to defer to them and we might miss some ideas. How can we neutralize that? So what I want to do is, if they're wanting to clamp on and say, nope, we're going to run the meeting, we're going to run it a certain way, then I at least want to throw out the concern and say, well, this is a tactic that I actually learned in a webinar about ways to make sure that we don't keep deferring to whoever's the ranking person. Now, by the way, that might be the person that I'm talking to. And so this is a courageous conversation, but just say, if that person is the only person of power in the room, I may say, my fear is as soon as you open your mouth, everyone is going to stop talking and they'll just defer to you. How can we neutralize that to make sure all voices are heard? Maybe we're not going to get the post-it note, but maybe I can get an agreement with them to weigh in last after everyone else has given their idea. But I want to just throw it back to them and say, how might we solve for this?
Okay, great. Let's see, next one. What do you do when leadership decides to skip the meetings and then they might fault the team because they didn't understand those priorities?
To skip the meeting, oh, that's a big one. A lot of times a meeting will get skipped to expedite and move forward. Like, we don't have time for that. We just got to go do it. And I've seen that done at various levels. I think the main thing that we can do, if we don't feel like we have any power in this, is talk about the impact of not having the meeting. And I literally want you to think about this thoughtfully and write it down. Write it down before you ever talk to somebody or send the email. And probably this is going to be one of those things that has to go up through the chain of command. You probably want to have a conversation first with your boss and say, I understand that we're in a hurry, and I understand that the meeting was canceled because of that, but here's the impact I'm seeing when we didn't do that. And sharing those concerns. Will it change the decision that's in front of you? No. But the best thing we can hope for is that they think twice before they cancel the meeting again.
Mhm. Okay. Yes. And let's see, we still have a little bit of time. How might you use some of the skills here, or what are the best practices to persuade a supervisor for more growth opportunities and support developing a career path internally?
It's a good question. One of the things that you can do to start that conversation in a productive way is to ask your boss what could I be doing even better? Solicit feedback first and get really specific on a recent project or initiative or priority that's important to them. You know, this project that we just completed, what could I have done even better? Because I'm trying to get even better. And by the way I'm thinking about this is developing in your current role first, and then having that as a springboard for future roles. So developing in current role, it means going from competency to mastery. You may be very competent in your job right now, but the question I would ask you is, are you the best at what you do?
Mhm.
And that could be a really good conversation. And by the way, most bosses would be really impressed with the fact that you would even acknowledge that and ask for feedback. And they may even ask you and say, why are you asking for feedback? And just say, well, I want to grow and develop in my career. I want to show you that I'm really maximizing the opportunity here, so then we can talk about future opportunities in the future.
Yeah.
Because the boss is often a gateway to laterals, to promotions, to even jobs in other parts of the organization. But I've got to send the signal that I'm going to do above and beyond what everyone else is doing as a way of differentiating myself, getting their attention, and also just showing that I want to learn new things. That's the other question you can ask is, how can we augment my job so I can learn X?
Mm.
And that can be a really fun conversation, because no one's going to turn away from you and say, oh, no, we're not going to have that conversation. Anytime someone's willing to learn something new, what we don't want to say is, what do I need to do to get promoted? That's a huge turnoff. It's not that you don't want to get promoted and that getting promoted isn't good, but if it's all about money, that will seem disingenuous. At least in my prior experience doing career counseling with people, it can't be about the money. It should be about the role and opportunities for growth to learn.
Yeah. I like that. Using an opportunity to discuss the opportunities. I
Yeah,
like that.
exactly right.
Yes. All right. So our next one is, what kind of process do you recommend for delivering bad news to a group which you have legitimate power, positional authority, especially when they don't have the ability to change the decision?
Deliver bad news. Could you repeat that again? I want to make sure that I'm zoning in on this one.
Yes, absolutely. What kind of process do you recommend for delivering bad news to a group which you have legitimate power over, positional authority, especially when they don't have the ability to change the decision?
Okay. I think I'm getting it. And I apologize if I'm not hitting the mark, but I think I know what you're getting at. People want to know the what and the why, and they also want to know your personal reaction. Now, if you're a person in authority, sometimes changes happen or things are implemented, decisions are made, and you may not like them. I want you to be as authentic as you can to your team. I'll give you an example. A leader that I know had something where they felt workload was going to be inequitably distributed to their team versus other teams. And probably the most powerful thing that this leader did, this is a leader I deeply respect and admire, is she said, I know this sucks, but here's what we're going to do about it. And I know that sometimes for someone in a role of authority, legitimate power, formal authority, that may not be something that you would feel comfortable doing, but you can say, I know this is going to be really challenging. In other words, just acknowledging what people might be feeling. But then as soon as that person said, I know this sucks, but they said, and here's what I think we can do about it. In other words, you don't stop with acknowledging that this is a tough decision. You have to give people hope and a path forward. And so that's going to take some thoughtful reflection on your part before you deliver that hard message. Here's the circumstance. Here's the decision that was made. Here's why it would be made. I know this is going to be a huge challenge, but I think we can overcome it. Here's what I propose we do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So transparency, which
being authentic and transparent with your own feelings in a situation. For the leader that I shared with it, that person's level of admiration and respect and followership went from a 3 to a 10 when they simply were candid with that person.
Okay. Well, great. So I will now move on. Thank you all for all of your questions. Sorry if I couldn't get to some of them.
Yes, thank you for asking questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jim, for your incredible, useful information and your candor. So this final slide here, just as I mentioned earlier, we will send a link to the webinar recording within a week of the webinar. And if you did enjoy the webinar and want to dive deeper into this topic, there's a list of upcoming courses. That very top one, Intentional Influence, Jim does instruct. So if you are interested in taking any of those courses, feel free to visit our website here and check out those classes. And we do also have an upcoming webinar, Managing Difficult Conversations. So thank you again, and thank you for joining us today. You guys all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming.